Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mo. I'll be conducting the workshop today. We're going to begin shortly and at 4 o'clock on the dot. So I'm just waiting on a few more people to join. I just want to let everyone know if you could be so kind in the chat to type in if you can hear me and you can see the screen that's being shared. That would be great. Thank you so much. Alexandra, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I wasn't speaking, sorry. Just waiting on a few more people to join, but as long as everyone here can hear me and see the screen, I think we should be fine. So to everyone who just joined, my name is Mo. I'll be conducting this workshop today. We're going to be going over SHSAT reading and poetry strategies specifically, but we're going to begin in a few more minutes because we're still waiting on a few more people to come in. Hi, everyone that just joined. My name is Mo. I'll be conducting the workshop today. We're going to be going over SHSAT reading and poetry strategies. I'm going to begin shortly. I know it's 4 o'clock, and I'll be the one conducting today's workshop. Can everyone just let me know that you can hear me and see the screen that's being shared? You can just let me know via the chat. All right, looks good. Okay, great. Okay, so since it's 4 p.m. right now and we have until 5:30, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. A lot of this might be review for some of you, it's as it should be, but I just wanted to go over, since the SHSAT is literally just 2 days away, any of the knowledge I have that I can help you all out with in terms of reading and poetry specifically. So reading comprehension on the test is a major portion of it. So, and of course it's all multiple choice, but it all comes down to breaking down the passage. So there's some strategies in place that has worked with me for many years. I'll do like a proper introduction now. So a little bit about myself. My name is Mo. I'm one of the tutors here at Kweller. I've been tutoring in the New York City area for now 14 years, and at Kweller for almost, well, 9 of them, almost going to be my 10th year. So I know a lot about various tests, but specifically for the SHSAT, I would say this is kind of like my bread and butter exam is the one I feel most comfortable with just because I've been doing it the longest. I went to Hunter College High School. From there, I sat for the SHSAT, and I gained admission to Stuyvesant. I scored a 692 on my SHSAT, and then after that, I decided to stay at Hunter and not go to Stuyvesant. And from there, I went to NYU on a full scholarship where I did my undergraduate, and then I got my MBA back at NYU a few years ago as well. And currently I work as a consultant. And while doing that, every free time that I have that's available, I like to spend time tutoring and helping kids out, navigate through the high school system, just the school system and academia in general in New York City. So onwards to the SHSAT and specifically reading. The first thing I want to do is kind of quickly do an overview of this strategy session that I've done in the past. Some of you may be familiar with it if you've seen any of the prior videos or workshops that I've been a part of. This is usually when I used to teach big classes for SHSAT. This would usually be like one of my first lessons. I call it the how to read. That's because everyone knows how to read, of course, right? But reading comprehension works differently on the real test than just, say, reading a book for school. And so that's what we're going to go over here. So reading is broken down into two sections. One is the reading aspect of it, and the other one is the questions. So it's very important that you know what are the steps and what order you should be doing them in. So I always say read the passage first, because a lot of students think about, should I read the question first? Should I read the passage first? What's working for me? In my experience, reading the passage first and building that habit is the most beneficial. And so the way that I go about doing that is I always make sure to read the passage first. And when I say read, I don't really mean read, I mean skim it. So the difference between reading and skimming is that when you skim, you ignore minor details, and instead you pay attention to the major/big points. So I'll give you all an example. If we are reading a passage about someone going to a convenience store and buying certain supplies, I don't really care for the list of the supplies that they're buying. Rather, I care about the bigger reason of why are they in that convenience store in the first place? What's their goal? Did anything eventful happen that might have hurt them from accomplishing their goal? And so on and so forth. The second one is, as you read, and you should annotate. Now, this is kind of like an art, right? You build this skill up over time. So annotating is when you take notes next to the passage on the margins about what the passage is about. So, you can underline, you could highlight. I don't think on the real test you're allowed a highlighter, but you can underline things. I'm a big fan of writing things out. Remember, your annotations only need to make sense to you because they're only for you, right? So they don't have to be complete sentences. Your annotations can be symbols. It could be just phrases instead of full-on sentences, as long as it makes sense to you. Usually, the best idea of when to annotate is to do it every paragraph. There are, of course, exceptions. So except if a paragraph is too complicated, right? Or if a paragraph is too long. So if a paragraph is too long, right, then you want to break it down into smaller parts. And you also want to break it down into smaller, more manageable parts, and then with those parts individually annotate them. If a passage is too complicated or complex, that's a sign for you to slow down, right? That means that this passage, right, has a lot of detail, or it might be written in Old English that you might not be comfortable with reading. So you need to slow down, take it sentence by sentence, and break it down. A lot of people will say that, well, Mo, if I do it this way, I'm going to take a lot of time in the reading, and I won't have enough time for questions. In my experience, the hardest part about reading comprehension in general is that you don't understand the passage, and therefore the questions are difficult to you. If you understand the passage as a whole, it doesn't really matter what they ask, you should be able to answer it, right? While you're annotating, remember these two acronyms, KISS and DID. KISS stands for keep it simple, stupid. Well, that's usually like what most people think of, but I say just keep it simple and short. And that's referring back to your annotations, right? If you read a paragraph and you end up summarizing it in a paragraph, you've kind of defeated the purpose of the whole annotation, right? And DID stands for dumb it down. So whatever you're reading, if you're able to if you're able to simplify it, right? If it's something super complicated, and you're able to simplify it, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to go back and look back at things and answer questions because all the details will be simplified for you. The it in both cases is, of course, the reading passage, right? What you're reading. All right. So far we've covered, always read the passage first. Don't actually just read, skim it, and annotate as you're going through the passages. All right. The next one is predict. Predict questions that you already know the answers to. So let me explain what that means. I'm going to take a little bit of a side, right? Imagine we're all in a class and I'm your social studies teacher and I'm teaching you about the Civil War. And let's say there's, class Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and there's 2 weeks of class about the Civil War. That's our unit. So let's say that here we're going to review the unit on these 2 days on the second week, and then here you'll have your big test. And every single day you'll be learning, right? So all of these days you'll be learning. Now, if I spent 3 days that I'm supposed to be teaching you about the Civil War on one particular battle, and I spend one entire review period on one particular battle in the Civil War, then to you as a student, that tells you that, wait, that battle is going to be important and a major part of my test. So I need to study that battle very well. In that same sense, if you see in the passage something is being repeated, or there's a sudden shift in mood or tone in the way that the narrator or the author is writing it, then that should tell you as the reader that, oh, wait, this is an important part of the passage. I need to remember it because chances are there will be a question about it. That's why the author is continuously repeating it. That's why there's a big shifting moment in the passage at this time, right? I hope that's clear to everyone. So that's where the analogy for the Civil War thing comes from. But I hope that it's clear now what I mean by predict questions that you already know the answers to. Because if you already see a major part of this passage being repeated over and over again, in your brain, you should be able to say that, oh, wait, this is an important part. There's gonna be a question about it. Let me make sure I'm paying extra close attention here. All right. The other thing with reading is you always want to pay attention to POV, which stands for point of view. And the reason why that's important is because there may be shifts, and especially in passages where there's dialogue, you want to be able to know who's the one that's actually doing the speaking. There are 3 major types of points of view: first person, second person, third person. And these are kind of some clues you can see from the passage that'll tell you which one it is. If the passage uses I or me, then it's first person. If it's you or we, then it's second person. This is usually when they're talking to the reader. It's very rare, but it's possible. And then the last one is third person, he, she, they, right? It's like a narrator who knows everything, but is outside of the story itself. Okay. I hope everyone's comfortable with the whole reading aspect or the left side of this chart. If there's any questions, please let me know before I move on. Okay, great. It doesn't look like anyone has any questions. All right, great. So let's move on to the questions. So of course, now we've read the passage and now comes the dreaded questions, the ones that are actually worth points. So how do we break this down? Well, I always say that in reading comprehension, your worst enemy is not a difficult passage. It's not the time of the test. The worst enemy in reading comprehension is you. And you are your worst enemy because of a little something known as doubt, right? So let me explain what doubt is. And I'm sure everyone's done it. I've done it. And it still creeps on all of us, no matter how confident we are. So let's say that, there's 4 choices. One of them is obviously right. So we're going to say, okay, A is not the answer, right? We're going to cross it out and say it's not the answer. B seems really good, but before I pick it, I need to do due diligence and, of course, look through the other answer choices to make sure that they're not going to be right. So C is wrong, and then D I'm unsure about. But then I go back to B, and then I flip-flop between B and D, even though a few seconds ago I was so sure B had to be the answer, right? And so you're going to pick D, and of course it's going to be wrong, and then B was the right answer all along. And so this has happened to all of us, right? Where we had the right answer, and then last second we switched out for a wrong one. So we're going to talk about how to minimize this doubt. Because if you can minimize this doubt, you give yourself a better shot on the test. Okay. So first, let's talk about types of questions that may show up. This is, of course, by no means a full comprehensive list, but it tackles a lot of the questions that we talk about. So there's main idea, vocabulary and context, inference question, detailed questions. Sometimes they go back to a specific line or paragraph and they ask you about why did the author write that. There's evidence questions sometimes, like where does it show that the author supports this? So you need to find evidence from the passage. Comparisons, right? There's author's mood, tone, purpose. There's not/except questions, right? Like which of the following, all of the following was in the passage except which one, or which of the following was not in the passage. And then of course, there's some graph, table, or chart interpretation questions. Which of the following data points disagrees with the passage, which one supports it, those kind of things. Okay, so of course, there's like a multitude of types. And what would make it very difficult is if you had to memorize a different strategy for each different type. The good news is it doesn't really matter what type of question shows up. They're all done the same way. All must be answered using passage-based evidence. If you don't have evidence from the passage to back it up, your answer can't be right. So this is something I used to do, and I am a big proponent for when I was test taking, and what I tell students. It's, say for example, I'm answering the questions. For number 12, I got B, right? Of course, I need to find some evidence for why I chose B. I couldn't have just been like, oh, this one sounds right to me, or I think this is what the passage said. Those are terrible reasons for picking an answer. Let me tell you why. When you try to remember things in a passage, you might forget, you might misremember, and that little loss in memory might be the difference between a right and wrong answer. There's no reason not to go back to the passage itself. So always go back and look for evidence. Right? That's the first thing that I'll bring up. The second thing is, since you skimmed the reading passage, you should know relatively where everything is located on the passage. So going back and picking an answer out really shouldn't be all that difficult, especially for evidence-based, right? So let's say I found the evidence for B in question 12 between lines 5 through 7. Those sentences between 5 through 7 told me the answer. So I'll answer your question just a bit, Alexandra. I see you asked a question. Yeah, feel free to ask questions in the chat and I will get to them in between the sessions. Also, just hold off on questions just a little bit until every time I kind of cue or ask for them, only because I may inadvertently answer your question while I'm still going through the process, okay? So going back to this, so I said that I got my evidence for number 12 from lines 5 to 7. So what I'll do is I'll write lines 5 to 7 next to number 12 and the B, the answer that I picked. And this is a little extra, but I always used to do it out of habit. From 5 to 7, I also put number 12. So the reason why I do this is for two reasons. Remember, we have to minimize that doubt to be a stronger reading comprehension test taker. Well, from having evidence backing up an answer choice, I feel more confident about it. And that'll make me more sure and less doubtful of my answer currently. 1. 2, it's a quick check. This is the second reason. Imagine you finish the entire test and you have about 20 minutes left. Now in 20 minutes, it's not realistic to read all the passages and reading and go through all the questions again. But what you can do is go through each of the questions and say, let me read this question. I said that the answer is B because of line 5 to 7. Well, I can go back to line 5 to 7 and just make sure that this evidence matches up with my answer. And if it does, I should be confident that that's the right answer. And that's how it's a quick check. Does everyone understand? Okay. So one of the questions I got from someone here now is, what would you do if you have an inference passage or when they ask you to interpret certain phrases, turning points, and how they affect the story? Because there isn't a line that you can point to the answer for those kind of questions. Good question. So the thing is, there always is, even in inference questions, right? Here's the number one thing about reading comprehension that you need to know. And this is true for all tests. And trust me when I say all tests, because I have sat through quite a few of them. I've taken the Hunter test, the SAT, the ISEE, the SHSAT, the PSAT, the LSAT, the MCAT, the GMAT, the GRE, the ACT. Basically, if there's a bunch of letters that make up a test, chances are I've taken it. And so with that being said, one thing that they all have in common is they always have reading comprehension. Now, another thing about these tests is, remember, whenever they ask a question, it has to be undisputedly right. Right? There has to be one correct answer that you can't really argue against. Like, in its evidence must be overwhelmingly better than all the other answers, or else they're going to get sued. People are going to be unhappy. They're going to say, hey, multiple answers were right. So for that reason, they have to make it clear cut. Even when they ask an inference question, The thing about inference questions is that usually you are right, Alexander. There isn't a single line that you can pinpoint to, but there's a few because it's a theme that keeps on occurring in the passage. Does that make sense? So that's the thing that if we come across an inference question today, I can show you a little bit more about, but it's usually multiple lines that will help build your evidence toward finding an answer. But even inference questions or interpreting certain phrases or turning points are related to multiple phrases around that. Should I take all the time to read the passage or just skim? I missed that part. You should skim passages, not fully read them. And I'll explain why. Because when you're skimming, you're going to be annotating, and that's how you're going to pay attention to the big details. The reason why we want to ignore the minor details is because once in a while, it's true, and those are what detail questions are. There will be a detail question which will ask you, what did Sarah go to the store to buy, right? So when you have a question like that and it's based off detail, just go back to the passage where they gave that list. You can just go to that part and now carefully actually read it and see what did Sarah buy, right? And then you can just go back and answer that question. Now you have evidence for it. So it's saving you time overall. And that's why I'm saying you should skim the passage, not read it. And you'll see me act this all out. How can I pace my reading? Sorry, I'm just reading a question again now. How can I pace my reading to make sure for the test I still understand the passage but still saving time? Well, that's the thing, right? This isn't something that should be new to any of you, right? Because the test is 2 days away, right? If it's 2 days away, then you should have the pacing aspect of this down, right? What should you do if you're not good at annotating? So Alexander, that's a very odd question in my opinion, because remember, annotations only need to make sense to you. So as long as your notes make sense to you, then you're fine, right? You'll see me take annotations down, and for someone else in this call right now, the annotations might not be enough for them, and for someone else, it might be too much for them. So it's all about balancing how you work through it, okay? Also, if everyone could, you can send your questions to everyone in the meeting rather than just me, because then it's easier for me to see it, okay? All right, so we're gonna continue going through the reading strategies now. So now that we have all of these question types and all must be answered using passage-based evidence, here are some other helpful tips for answering multiple choice questions, right? And so this might actually help the next person out who asks, what should I do if I'm stuck in a multiple choice? So don't just pick true statements. That's the number one mistake people make, is like, no, answer choice A is true. I'm like, sure, of course it is. There's evidence on the passage that says it's true. Make sure that they answer the question being asked. So when you're picking an answer choice, make sure that it answers the question being asked. Because if it's true, but it's not answering the question being asked, then it doesn't make sense, right? Physically cross out wrong choices. So this is another thing. I've seen people do this before, like in front of me in real time while I'm working with them. And also, sometimes I have a tendency to do that. So if I know that A is wrong, I go through my answer choices and I'm like, okay, B sounds good, D sounds good. And I go back and I see I didn't cross out A. So I think to myself, why was A supposed to be right? Did I have a possibility? I thought it was bad. So you want to cross it out physically so it doesn't enter your mind again, right? Because then it'll build on that doubt, right? So someone just asked this, can extremes be right sometimes? So here's there are exceptions to it, right? So I say avoid extreme answers. Extreme answers have words like always, never, hate, right? Things like that. So let me write that one in as well, right? So if they're very, very extreme, chances are they're going to be wrong. So you want to avoid them. Instead, look for safer words: may, usually, often, enjoys, right? Or wishes it was better, things like that. There is an exception. So the exception for when extremes can be right is if the passage itself states it with an extreme word. So if the passage says someone hates this, then, and they don't mean it in I hate going to the mall or something like that, right? Like they actually mean hate, then it's going to be the right answer. The chances are of this being true, like where an extreme answer is right, is less than 1%. In almost all cases, extreme answers are never right. So just keep that in mind. So if you see an extreme answer and you're thinking about it, you better have a lot of good evidence to back it up. And it must be directly stated from the passage itself in that way, okay? When you're stuck between two answer choices, this is usually the number one thing that people have an issue with. When stuck between two answer choices, dissect their differences and pick the one with more passage-based evidence. Be hypercritical of the choices. So what do I mean by that? When I say dissect, look at what's making them different, right? Because there has to be a difference between them. That's why they're both separate answer choices and not the same. And then look at the evidence for each one. If they're so different that they're, not even similar, just saying two different things, right? And then based off that, you can see which one is going to be true. Count on previous answers to support harder questions. So remember, the passage as a whole is building to something, right? So you should go work off of that, right? So if you have other answers to previous questions that you're sure of, you can use them in support of harder questions later on. Answer questions before looking at choices, whenever possible. But I made it so that it's linked with main idea. So in my opinion, main idea question of every passage is actually the easiest. Let me explain what I mean. When you get a main idea question, you just read something and then it's asking you, okay, what the heck did you just read? And so to me, that should be a very easy question to handle. So what trips people up on main idea questions is that the answer choices. So when they read the answer choices, they're like, well, half of the passage was about this, the other half was about this. They did mention this at least once in the passage, and then they get confused. So this is what's worked for me the majority of the time, and a lot of students that I've taught since. I'll have them cover up the answers with their hand, like physically cover up the answers with their hand, read the main idea question, and in their mind, think to themselves, okay, this is the main idea, so on and so forth. And then after saying the main idea in their own words to themselves, they'll uncover their hand or uncover the choices, right? Remove their hand from the choices and read them to see which one is closest to that answer. Because if you've read the passage and you've done it correctly and you understand it, then your main idea should be the right main idea. That's how you should go off of it. All right, see, there were two questions here. Let me see. For nonfiction passages, someone asked, if one of the answer choices depends on outside information that is generally accepted as true but isn't stated in the passage, should we cross it out immediately? That's a tough one. The rule of thumb is that if you shouldn't use any outside information to do any passages. Of course, there's like common sense knowledge that of course everyone can use. So that's fine. But if you have a nonfiction passage, what you shouldn't do is bring outside knowledge into the problem itself, the question itself. What is the best way to understand vocabulary in a passage or question that you might not know? Okay, so whenever you're dealing with vocabulary that you might not know, the best way to do it is to use context clues. And the second way to do it is to use the answer choices themselves for vocabulary. You can kind of do the plug and play back. So the plug and play back is when you take out the word, you plug in one of the choices and you play the sentence back. You read it from beginning to end with the new word. See if it makes sense. Does the tone work? Is there evidence that it's supposed to be a positive word or a negative word? So one of the things I talked about before is to dumb it down, right? And when I say dumb it down, I mean all of reading, right? So what that means is, when I mean by dumb it down, I mean just simplify it to, is it a good word? Is it a bad word? Do they mean something positive or do they mean negative? So on and so forth. Okay, I got another question that asked, what is the best way to approach a passage you don't understand? Well, for that, I always say slow down, right? If there's a passage you don't understand, that means it's too complicated. In my experience of doing so many different test preps and just like tests in general, it's usually the most complicated passages that have the easiest questions, the most straightforward questions. So all you have to do is just take the time to read through the passage and understand it to get all the questions right? So a lot of people think, well, no, I'm going to run out of time if I'm spending too much time on the passage. Well, you have a chance of getting all those easy questions right if you just spend a bit more time. And since the questions are easy, they won't take you as long. So that's the trade-off there, right? What if you think you understand the passage, but you actually don't? I'm assuming that's more so for poetry. So when we go to poetry, I'll kind of work through some tips for you, because that's usually where I've seen students kind of trip up on. If you don't understand, and I'll do examples here, so maybe that might help further answer that question with more specifics. Let me see. So I'm going to continue going through the list just because we're almost at the end of it. So for vocabulary in context or paragraph specific questions, right, go back to where they tell you to find evidence. So let me give you an example. If there's a sentence here and they use the vocabulary word, right, that they're asking about the vocab in context, You should read the sentence before, the sentence containing, and the sentence after the vocabulary word. So wherever they tell you to go back to, the evidence has to be close to it or around that area. So you have to go back and pinpoint specifically with those things, right, to that area of the passage in order to find the best supporting evidence. Go back to plus or minus 3 lines and lines included, right? So there you go, right? I'm even telling you how far to go back in terms of whenever possible, right? You're always trying to make sure that you're able to answer the question in your own words, but sometimes it's impossible to do so without looking at the choices. So use process of elimination for not/except questions because they're a classic part of when to use POE or process of elimination. Remember, if part of an answer choice is wrong, then the entire answer choice is wrong. So if you're like, Mo, half of this answer is like the best possible answer, great, good for it. But if part of the answer is wrong, then it doesn't matter how great one part of it is, the entire thing is wrong, and you have to cross it out. In reading comprehension, always go direct. So what do I mean by that? And what does this little diagram at the bottom mean? So let me explain. And this comes specifically from a passage from a few years ago where they talk about like this volcano that erupted and it caused there to be the year without a summer. So let me go through what I mean by that. So if you have an event A that leads to B, and B causes C, and C causes D, and then D causes E. And the question is, what caused E to happen? What would be the right answer? Is it going to be A, B, C, or D? In the real world, most people would say that it's A, because that's the root of the problem. And in the real world, that's most likely what people are looking for. A is what eventually caused E, so we're getting to the root of the problem and we're getting rid of it. But on the test, you always want to go direct. E was caused by D. So this is going to be the right answer, and these are all going to be wrong. And so that's what I mean by in reading comprehension, especially for cause and effect, always go direct. What was the step that happened right before? Okay. So these are all of my tips in terms of reading. This is just general reading. This works for fiction, nonfiction. And then with poetry, we're going to add a few more notes later on. But does anyone have any questions on anything that we've gone over so far? Is any part of this unclear? Do you have any tips for guessing answer choices? So whenever possible, my tip is try to get it down to fewer choices, because if you get it down to fewer choices, your chances of guessing and getting it right increase, right? If you have 4 answer choices and you guess, it's a 1 out of 4, they're 25% chance. But if you're able to knock out 2 answer choices, then it's a 1 out of 2 or 50% chance. So that's much better. That's my only guessing tip. Some people say that, oh, when in doubt, always guess C or B or some other random letter. For me, that's never been helpful advice, because the chance of any of the letters being correct is exactly 1/4, right? Depending on how many answers, or 1/5, depending on the test that you take, right? And how many answer choices there are. Any other questions on this page in particular? Okay, so there's a few more questions. Let me go through them right now. So the first one is, what if you don't understand the vocabulary in one of the answer choices? That is probably one of the hardest things to deal with. So what I always say is, if you don't understand that one, right, first do process of elimination. Are all the other ones going to be wrong? If the other ones are wrong, then it has to be that one if you don't understand it. But if any of the other ones are right, I would probably just go with one of them instead. Should I annotate on every passage? What types of passages should I annotate on? I annotate on every passage. Why risk it, right? Every passage has questions and every question counts, so why risk it? Do you have any tips for reviewing ELA? Should we reread the passage or review the lines we marked, or for the question, or just skim the passage? So when reviewing, what I do is I just go back to each individual question and I read the lines of evidence for each answer choice that I picked. And by reading just the lines for each answer choice, right, the evidence, I can kind of like confirm whether or not this answer still makes sense. And that's how I do it. How can you really make sure you're correct with the answer choice you choose? confidence, right? Remember, you are your own worst enemy in reading comprehension because of doubt. So once you apply these strategies over and over and over again, right, practice makes progress, right? You'll be getting better and better and better, and you'll start seeing the results for yourself, and you'll have more confidence in how you do it. Best way to skim: questions or text first. Always read the text first. What can help if there are two answer choices that are so similar and you can't figure out which one is right? So Emma, we covered this a few minutes ago. So when you're stuck between two answer choices, dissect their differences. Literally look at what words are they using. Is one word more extreme than the other? And pick the one with more passage-based evidence. So if you had to go look for evidence for each one, which one has more evidence to back it up? Right? And just be hypercritical of the choices. What's the best mindset for the SHSAT? No worries, Emma. So the best mindset for the SHSAT is this one. So there's a study in psychology that has, and I always tell students this, and I have some tips for you guys at the end of what you should be doing the morning of the test, as well as the day before the test, which is tomorrow. So we'll get to those at the end, because I want to actually show you these strategies in place, but I'll go over this for now. This is performance. They studied your performance versus your stress levels. So if your stress was all the way over here, you're very high, your performance was very low. If you were not stressed at all, your performance was very low because you didn't really try. But it looks like a little, it looks like a little bell curve. What that means is when you're too stressed out, right? Like this person over here, you freeze. You're not able to do anything. You're making silly mistakes. You're forgetting that 1 + 1, you're saying 1 + 1 is like 4 or something like that. And if you're over here, you're too nonchalant. You don't care about it enough. And so you're making silly mistakes as well. But if you're stressed out about the exam, but not too stressed out, you'll get the best performance out of yourself. It's what's going to keep you on your toes, making sure that you're doing all the right things that you're supposed to. So that's the best mindset to go in for the SHSAT or just any test in general. And the reason why you shouldn't have to start off with too much stress is because this is the way I see it. Always overstudy and over-prepare, because whenever you enter any kind of test, you're going to be stressed. But if you overstudy and you over-prepare, your starting stress level won't be over here. It'll be where we want it to be instead. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. And Lucius, I hope that answered your question. Do you suggest that we read the questions of a passage first, or do we read the passage first, or it doesn't matter? So I think you may have been new, Timothy. We just finished going over this. Always read the passage first, bud. So, and when you read the passage, you actually skim it. Here's my whole philosophy about reading the questions first. So, because people ask me this all the time, and everyone has different strategies, but this is how I feel about it. This is what I've seen. When you read the questions first, what ends up happening is, as you're skimming through the passage looking for evidence for the questions, you're doing it multiple times because you're not getting the feel for the entire passage as a whole. So you go back, you look for one question's answer, and you're like, oh, I found the evidence for this. And then you go back and you answer the question. And then you start all over for the next question, and then for the next question, and for the next question. Either that happens and you do it question by question that way, or you read all the questions first, and then you go and read the passage. And as you're reading the passage, in the back of your head, you're distracted by, oh, was this a question? Oh, did they ask a question about this? And sometimes on a more difficult passage, you're going to miss the passage as a whole because you're going to be too focused on the questions in general. And that's the biggest issue with this, right? You lose focus on the actual passage. Exactly, Nicole, I agree with you 100%. So for that reason, you're going to end up rereading the passage multiple times now, and you've actually wasted more time doing it that way. And time is something very valuable on this test, right? Because you only have 3 hours to complete the entirety of the test. Okay, so I hope that answered your question, Timothy. All right, with that being said, let's actually go ahead and do some practice now. Let's put these principles into action. So where I'm picking the passage out from, and I think all of you have this, is from the 2022 SHSAT Handbook Form B test. So we're going to go make our way over to the reading comprehension, and we're going to start with the first reading comprehension passage that goes Wolves of the Sea. Okay, so you'll see me read through it, and you'll see me annotate. Gideon, should you start working on your harder subject or your easier subject? So I'll actually go over that near the end, since that's more of a general test question. Okay. So the last about 10 to 15 minutes, I'll leave just to go over final SHSAT tips. So right now we're just going to focus heavily on reading and poetry instead. Okay. All right, Wolves of the Sea. So I'm just getting ready. So for me, I always just like to look ahead to see, okay, how many paragraphs is this? Is there any really long paragraph that I need to separate out into multiple pieces to annotate, so on and so forth. So let me go through, I'm just gonna kind of walk through it out loud, and I'm gonna pause it. So I'm gonna think out loud really is what I'm gonna do. And then I'm gonna stop to see if anyone has any questions on anything that I did, to then, what's it called? To then, if you guys have any questions on my strategies, then I can address them before we go on to the questions. Okay. All right. Wolves of the Sea. The cool and misty landscape of the Great Bear Rainforest can be found along the coast of British Columbia, Canada, and its nearby islands from Vancouver Island to the Alaskan border. Within this protected area, wolves roam the forests, islands, and beaches. When biologist Chris Darremont began to study these wolves, he wanted to confer with the local First Nation groups, as Aboriginal Canadians are known, in order to learn what they knew about these wolves. He spoke with Chester Starr, an elder of the Heiltsuk Nation that has occupied the Great Bear Rainforest for thousands of years. What Starr had to say about the wolves changed Dermont's perception of the animals. Okay, so basically, sorry, Annabelle, we're not going to be reviewing math because this workshop is specifically for reading and poetry. So first body paragraph. So we have a scientist, CD, and he's going to ask the Native Americans, but specifically called First Nations in Canada, right? So I'm going to write Canada, about wolves. And to me, this is enough. That's what this paragraph is about. I don't really need to focus on anything else. Okay. So let me go about number 2 now. Starr asked Darremont which wolves he and his team were going to study, the timber wolves, mainland wolves, or the coastal wolves on the islands. The question took Darremont by surprise. Biologists always believed that the wolves that are sometimes spotted swimming between islands and eating salmon are the same wolves that live on the mainland. Darremont was intrigued by Starr's classification of the wolves as 2 different groups. At first, he was hesitant to accept the idea. The distances between the mainland and the island are small, less than a mile. Why would the wolves on the islands be any different from the wolves on the mainland? To find out, Darremont and his research team studied the wolves on the island and in densely forested territory of the Great Bear Rainforest for 10 years. Okay, cool. So there's one sentence that stood out to me. So I'm just going to kind of underline that because that's what this whole thing is about. Why would the wolves on the island be any different from the wolves on the mainland? So I'm not a big fan of underlining because I find that if you underline something, you end up rereading it. And the whole point of doing this entire method is to avoid rereading something so much. Does that make sense? But of course, there are exceptions. Once in a while, the paragraph in the passage does such a great job of summarizing itself in one sentence that it, you can't help but underline it. So basically, the First Nations person told Darremont, right? So FN, First Nations person, told scientist, diff wolves, which is short for different wolves. And scientist dude was like, huh? And I'll make a little drawing. For me, that's easier to remember, right? And it keeps me more engaged. I've noticed with a lot of students in the past that they have a hard time staying engaged with the passage because they're like, no, I get bored by this too easily. So what I do is try to make your annotations kind of come alive and make them fun, but also very informative. All right, let's see. So they're going to do a study, right? Comparing the 2 wolves. So when they're studying, let's see what their study finds. Throughout the study, Darremont recorded several significant observable differences between the sea wolves, as they are nicknamed, and the mainland wolves. Compared with the mainland wolves, the sea wolves are smaller in size and are strong swimmers. In 1996, sea wolves were spotted on an island nearly 8 miles from any land formation. While mainland wolves almost exclusively eat meat such as deer and elk and teach their young to hunt for land animals, sea wolves get as much as 90% of their nutrition from the sea and teach their young to dig for clams and catch fish. Sea wolves regularly swim between islands and have known to sneak up on seal, sunning itself on a rock, and make a leaping attack from the water. Some salmon-eating mainland wolves come and go from the islands with the fish spawning season, but sea wolves are full-time island residents. Darremont suspects that some sea wolves live their entire life on the islands. Okay, so what was the evidence, or what did the study come across? There are 2 different wolves. sea and land. And how are they different? Diet and habits. I'm not going to spend time writing out all the details because, like I said, skimming means you ignore the minor details. I know that their diets are different, and I know that their habits are different in terms of what they do. That's all that's really important. If there's a question about their diet, I know which paragraph to go back to. Next up, the sea wolves display not only physical and behavioral differences, but also genetic variations from the mainland wolves. After collecting and analyzing the DNA in 800 samples of gray fur and wolf waste, researchers could produce hard biological evidence that sea wolves had genetic markers that made them distinct from mainland wolves. Genetic markers are variation in a DNA sequence that can be used to identify individuals or species because it is passed down to offspring. Dermont hypothesizes that a change in habitat led to the eventual genetic differences between sea wolves and mainland wolves. Many years ago, loss of habitat and food sources forced some mainland wolves out to the islands. They learned to eat everything from kelp and fish, eggs, to the remains of sea creatures that washed up on the beach. Wolves living on the islands and mainland wolves became more isolated and rarely mated with each other. Over time, the two types of wolves became more distinct. So here, this is his prediction and also DNA evidence to back it up. DNA differences also, as well. And Darman has a theory. And I kind of know what his theory is about, but if they ask again, I know where to go back to, right? It turned out that Chester Star was right all along. It sounded totally bizarre at first, admits Darmont, that there could be two versions of the species, but now realizes that this skepticism definitely reflected my ignorance of indigenous knowledge at the time. Learning to trust the wisdom of the Hiltzook people opened Darmont up to knowledge accumulated over millennia and positioned him so that he could gather new scientific evidence about one of British Columbia's most elusive species, the sea wolf. So now here he acknowledges, right? Darmont acknowledges the help of the First Nations people, right? The Native Americans. Okay. So I know it seemed like it took a long time for me to do this. I was looking at the clock. It took me a little bit less than 5 minutes to do it out loud. That's because I was saying everything out loud and explaining myself. So over time, it really shouldn't be that much of a difference between you and I when you're reading it to yourself, right? Was there any questions on any of my annotations, right? My annotations are clear to me here. I can go through it right now. So CD is a scientist, and he's talking to FN, which is the Canadian First Nations people, so they're Native Americans, about wolves. So FN told the scientists that they're different. Wolves are different. Scientist guy was like, huh, what do you mean? And then so they did a study and they found out that there were two different wolves, one for the sea and one for the land. Their differences were in their habits and their diet. Their DNA differences as well, they found. And German has a theory about why that happened. I think his theory was about how there was some kind of loss of land and the two different species, or not species, but the two different groups of wolves, one went to the sea and the other one went to the land. And over time, they only mated within amongst each other and passed down the same genes. And then the next part is Darmont acknowledges the help of the First Nations people and his discoveries. Okay, let me go to what people are saying right now in the chat. Okay. So Avish says, I think you're reading a bit fast. I was going at a pretty steady pace for me. And since I was doing this out loud, I think if you were to read it in your mind, it would be faster. So I think it would be a similar speed. What if annotating takes too long? Well, that's the thing. In theory, you've been annotating for a while, and so you're used to the annotations. And remember, your annotations only need to make sense to you, so they don't have to be long-winded sentences by any means. And Alexander said, what if you're not used to annotating? Is it worth doing it this late? Probably not, right? So if you're changing anything up at this point, it's usually a bit too late because 2 days from now, you don't want to start learning a whole different new strategy. Whatever's been working for you, you want to keep doing that. What you can do, however, because then you might be asking yourself, well, wait, Mo, then what's the point of teaching me new tips or tricks at all? You want to be able to incorporate those that you're able to still incorporate. So let me go back to just that list of tips, right? If you're stuck between two choices, regardless of whether you annotate or not, you should be doing this, right? Regardless of whether you annotate or not, you should be able to give evidence, right? Does that make sense? What if it takes longer to read and there is no time to annotate? So yeah, that's kind of like what I've been saying, Annabelle, that by now you've figured out whether or not your annotations work or not. So if you're someone who isn't used to annotating because it takes you too long, then you shouldn't annotate because it's gonna take up too much of your time, right? With 2 days left, you can't really practice a completely whole new fundamental way of approaching the passage. What you can still do, though, is take tips that work regardless of what method you use. The test is on December 4th, I believe. Oh, sorry, not
December 2nd.
December 2nd. Yeah. So it's this Thursday because today's the 30th. So yeah. Okay. Is everyone okay? Any other questions before I move on to the actual questions in the passage? Oh, it might be different for public and private schools. I'm not entirely sure about it. All I know is that the first batch of students taking the test will be taking it on Thursday. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the questions. The details in paragraph 1 contribute to a central idea of the passage by showing that Dermot did what. So let me go back. The biggest and most important part about paragraph 1 in the passage, right, and you'll notice I'm going back, is that he asks local First Nation groups, right, the Native American Canadians, who about what they knew about the wolves. So that's the most important part. So let's go back. So for number 11, which one talks about that? So A says, believe the Great Bear Rainforest was an ideal location to study birds. Nope, that's going to be wrong. Values different perspectives because the information that Starr provided influenced the focus of Dermont's research. This is exactly what we were talking about. So B is a great answer, but we have to always go through all the choices. Thought the Great Bear Rainforest would provide opportunities to study different groups of wolves because the area includes forests and islands. That's not what he thought because he didn't think that they were different wolves to begin with. Understands the importance of respecting local community members because Dermont sought permission. So here's the key thing. He talked to them, he didn't seek permission. So the answer is going to be B. I hope that's clear. Let me see. What if you find no right answers for the multiple choice? That's impossible, Annabelle, because there has to be a right answer. And on top of that, it's these tests are checked by multiple people, and they're made about a few months before you guys take it. So they go through a bunch of proofreading sessions. Why can't it be A? Well, we said that the main thing that they talked about was a central idea. And remember, the central idea is that there are two types of wolves. That central idea came from his conversation with the First Nations group, right? In order to learn what they knew about the wolves. And when he spoke to him, he said, which one would you like, right? It says what Starr had to say about the wolves changed his perception of animals. So remember what I said about important parts of the passage. Whenever there's a change in something or a shift or something's being repeated, it has to be very important. So there's gonna be a question about it. So in a lot of ways, number 11 is that question. The details in paragraph 1 contribute to a central idea of the passage. So not just paragraph 1, but the passage itself. Does that make sense? Okay, great. All right, number 12. Why does the author include details of other conversations between Starr and Dermont in paragraph 2? So this is a why is the author doing this? Well, this entire reason is the why Dermont did his research the way he wanted it to, right? It was this question that led him to do research about this topic. And that's what came from their conversation. So the correct answer for number 12 has to reflect that exact idea. So let's go through the choices again. To explain why Starr had closely observed the relationship, no. Starr was not the one that closely observed the relationship between the two groups that Dermont wanted to study. Starr just knew this fact from living there and being there for a while. To show that Dermont was hoping to work with Starr, he didn't work with Starr. He was just asking Starr, what can you tell me about the groups? So that's wrong. To highlight that Dermont was unfamiliar with the area and expected Starr to help him find wolves to study. He never asked Starr to help him find wolves to study. He asked him, which wolves should I study? So G is wrong. So just from process of elimination, it has to be H, but let's read it. To emphasize that the question asked by Starr caused Darmon to review his initial assumption about the wolves. Yeah, what was his initial assumption? He thought that all the wolves were the same. And so after talking to Starr, he realized, oh no, they're different, and that's how I can study them. So that's why the answer to number 12 is H. All right, number 13. Read this sentence from paragraph 4. After collecting and analyzing the DNA in 800 samples of gray fur and wolf waste, researchers could produce hard biological evidence that sea wolves had genetic markers that made them distinct from the mainland wolves. The phrase hard biological evidence conveys what? That the goal of the research team was to do what? Well, the goal of the research team was not to just go off of observations, right? But they wanted to see if there was anything that could have disproved their theory, because they needed to find more evidence, right? And they needed evidence that could either support them or disprove them. And that way they wouldn't publish what they found because it would have been disproved already. So let's see, develop a procedure in order to ensure their study yielded plentiful data about the wolves. I mean, it talks about data, so I'll keep it for now. Seek definitive scientific proof of the number of wolf species present in the area of study. Definitive number of wolf species. So sometimes if you're reading this too quickly, you might miss that. So remember, they're talking about not wolves, of wolf species. So there are two, right? They wanted to see if the wolves were of different species. That's why they're examining their DNA, right? They wanted to see if the sea wolves were completely different from the land wolves genetically. So B is an even better answer than A. So I'm gonna get rid of it and keep B for now. C, conduct a study to evaluate multiple theories about the diets. No, this is off topic, so it's going to be wrong. Discover if the new data would provide information different from that of previous studies. So it's not, there weren't any previous studies done, right? At least he didn't mention it in the passage, so we can't assume that there were, so D has to be wrong. So the only answer that would make sense is answer choice B. Any questions on how I did any of the first three? Okay, great. Let's move on to the next one then. So 3 more questions here. The author uses, should we keep this pace throughout the test? I find that this is a good pace to go with. Of course, now it's unfair to compare like my pace with yours because I've been doing this for longer than some of you have been alive. So what I say is I'm doing this out loud and I'm kind of going what to me is a bit slower. So if you can do it with yourself, right, at this pace, like on your own in your mind, then I think you've got a great pace for the test. Okay. If you go a little bit slower than this, that's still perfectly fine. Okay. The author uses the word admits in paragraph 5, most likely to do what? So let's go back to paragraph 5. I actually don't remember where he uses admits. So let's scan it for that word. It turned out Chester was right. Bizarre. Okay. Admits. Okay. So it says now we have to read it carefully. It sounded totally bizarre at first, admits Darmon, that there could be 2 versions of the species, but now he realizes this skepticism definitely reflected my ignorance of indigenous knowledge at the time. So he admits in this case is saying that he thought the opposite, and he's now coming clean about it, right? He's saying that the idea of 2 different versions was bizarre. That was his first thought, but ultimately it proved out to be right. Does that make sense? And if we go back to paragraph 2, there's even more evidence about it because it says he, like other scientists, right, thought that there was only 1 species. Darmon and his research studies, let me see. The timber wolves, mainland wolves, or the coastal wolves on the islands. The question took him by surprise because he believed, there we go, biologists had always believed that the wolves were sometimes spotted swimming between islands and eating salmon are the same wolves that live on the mainland. So we got 2 pieces of evidence for it. So let's go back now. So the correct answer for 14, note that Darmon's genetic research verified a theory based solely on field observations. No. Imply the Darmon study was disappointing because the conclusion that he reached was not original. That's not part of it either. Emphasize that his study ultimately confirmed an idea that he had initially doubted. Yeah, it's one that he didn't believe in. So G looks great. Let's look at H. Highlight that Darmon's results led him to draw a conclusion from his research that his team did not agree with. So that's the difference between these 2. Did his team not agree with, or did he not agree with? Remember, he was skeptical as well. So it can't just be his team. So H is wrong and G has to be our answer. And this is what I mean by if you're stuck between two answer choices, this is how you break it down. Let's move on to number 15. Which sentence or the passage best supports, so evidence question, the idea that sea wolves had successfully adapted to living on the islands? So the key word is they had successfully adapted to living on the islands. So let's go back. It's going to be part of their differences, because in their differences, it talked about how they were able to live, right? So here it says, in 1996, sea wolves were spotted on an island near 8 miles from any other land formation. While mainland wolves almost exclusively eat meat, such as deer and elk, and teach their young to hunt for land animals, sea wolves get as much as 90% of their nutrition. So they're able to still live completely off the sea and teach their young to dig for clams and to catch fish. So they're going to have youngs that can also pass down the same traditions and live on in the same exact manner as sea wolves. So that's the evidence that I'm looking for here. While mainland wolves almost exclusively eat meat, such as deer and elk, and teach their young to hunt. Yep, there we go. This is like literally the sentence that I picked. I'm 99% sure that A is going to be right. Always check everything else just to be on the safer end of things. Sea wolves regularly swim between islands and have been known to sneak up on a seal, sunning itself on a rock and make a leaping attack from the water. So this doesn't, I know that it might seem like it implies getting food, but this is a particular instant of seal sunning itself, whereas B is much more specific with 90% clams and catching fish. Darabont suspects that some sea wolves live their entire life on the islands. Well, that's a suspicion, right? So it won't be as good of a support as a fact. So C is out. D. Darabont hypothesizes that a change in habitat led to the eventual genetic differences between sea wolves and mainland wolves. So these genetic differences don't always or necessarily clearly indicate adaptations to living on the islands. So that's why D is going to be wrong and A is going to be our correct answer. Lastly, number 16. How did a change in habitat most affect the wolf population of the Great Bear Rainforest over time? So this is asking over time, right? Well, think back, take a step back, think about what this passage was about. It was about how the wolf population in the forest changed. And from there came two different wolf populations, ones that were coastal and others that were not, that were mainland. So that's what we're looking for, that multiple species can come out of the Great Bear Rainforest over time. And so when I'm looking for that answer, I'm drawn immediately to G because I'm scanning and I see new genetically distinct species. So I want to put G as my first answer, but we got to go through all of them. It caused some of the wolves to learn new hunting techniques in order to catch increasingly scarce prey. It never talks about how scarce the prey is, so that's going to be wrong, right? Remember, part of an answer is wrong, the whole answer is wrong. It caused the wolves to form smaller packs. They never talked about the size of the packs, that's wrong. And H, it caused the wolves to adapt their diet as different food sources became available in the area. This is pretty good, and a lot of people may pick H, but the only issue is not all the wolves adapted their diet. Only the sea wolves did. The other wolves, the mainland wolves, stayed using the same diet as before. So that's going to be wrong. And this is what I mean by watch out for all these little tiny details that they're going to try to get you with. So the answer has to be G. Any questions on this passage?
No.
Okay. If you're in the call, please stay muted. If you are going to say anything, please write it into the chat, just because it can get very distracting if everyone tries to talk at once. All right. Any questions on anything in this passage? Okay. So I hope seeing the strategies actually in play gives you a bit more confidence behind them and how to use them. I want to do one other passage before I give you any final tips about the SHSAT and test taking in general, but that's going to come from a poem because I want to do a little bit of poetry. So I'm going to search for the poem that there should be a poem in one of these passages. So that's what I'm looking for here. Okay, The Serpent Mound. Okay. So before we start going through this, is there any radical differences between poetry and just other regular reading comprehension. That's the key thing that people always ask me. So there really isn't, to be honest. And so let me go through what I mean by that. In regular reading comprehension, you have paragraphs. And yeah, Lucius is right. In poetry, you have the equivalent of paragraphs, which are stanzas. Now, remember how I said that if there's repetition, it's a moment to watch out for? Stanzas usually come with some patterns in play. What patterns? Sometimes stanzas have the same length, and other times stanzas rhyme. When stanzas rhyme, that's known as their rhyme scheme. So I'm not going to look at this in particular because not all poems need to rhyme, but if they do rhyme, pay attention to that. So it's usually the ending word. They could go A, B, and that's one stanza. And they could do C, D, and that's another stanza. And what this is saying is that the first and third words rhyme, and the second and fourth words also rhyme. And they continue that format. Now, whenever you see a break in that format, like for example, if the next stanza goes E, F, E, then this stanza is important. The reader, or sorry, the poet, right, the author, wants to grab your attention by throwing you off, right, from the rest of the poem in the pattern. So that should tell you that, oh wait, there's something important going on here. And that's how poems are supposed to be interpreted. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay. Aside from just the rhyme scheme, the other way that things can change is if instead of going to 4-line stanzas, there's a random 6-line stanza here. So EF, and let's say G and G. And then they go back to your regular HI. What that means is a break in meter, right, in lines. Would a break in meter also mean that something is important? Yes. Whenever there's something that's different from the rest of the poem, it's an indication that pay attention here, there's something important going on. And if they ever tell you to pay attention here specifically, that means that there will be questions about it. Is that clear to everyone? Okay. So now let's read through this poem. Before I read through the poem, the other thing to keep in mind is be completely familiar with figurative language, metaphor, simile, personification, just because you can't take things literally in poems all the time. You have to think about what's the deeper meaning behind it, what are they trying to convey. Any questions about that? Okay, great. Let's take a look. Serpent Mound. Always read, and this is important, not just for a poem, but whenever you have any kind of passage, always read the little excerpt on top that gives information. So, Serpent Mound. The Great Serpent Mound, located in Adams County, Ohio, is a human-made mound of earth the researchers believe was created between 300 BC and AD 1100 by an indigenous culture. Okay. Ohio, 1846. Brush Creek stood low when the museum men came with their measuring tapes and sketchbooks. It was winter. Fringed with ice, the creek doubled back on itself as if it had forgotten something. Pa was in Cincinnati or else on his way home, so Ma told me to lead the men into the marshy low grounds. It being winter, there was little underbrush to speak of. In the summer, there would have been briars, poison ivy, biting flies. I listened for the swish of a beaver's heavy tail, the chitter of a chickadee, or the cry of a hawk, but the winter silence of the creek pressed down on all of us like a weight. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. Just because there aren't as many, I guess, stanzas here, and I just want to make sure that I stop at a very reasonable place in the passage. So let's try to figure out what's going on here. So there are people coming in from the museum. I would think that there are archaeologists, and they're doing they're doing research about the area, and our narrator is just watching them, right? And they're at the marsh, right, which we can assume is going to be Serpent Mound, and they're just trying to find out more about it, right? So, and the narrator is making a comment about the difference in seasons, right? How the summer is so much more full of life, and the winter is silent. Okay, so those are the things I want to write down, jot down. So one is museum men, so archaeologists. Pa was in Cincinnati or else on his way home. So this is like where their father is. And Ma told me to lead the men into the marshy low grounds. And so this is the winter versus summer at Serpent Mound. Okay. Any questions? Okay. The humps in the ground were all but invisible until you were right up on them. The figure was even less obvious. The sinuous body, this tail coiled 3 times around, and at the other end, the mouth wide open. In the summer, the creek bottom was crowded with so much life you could trip over the ridges of earth before you saw anything at all. In winter, you could climb a tree and get some idea of the whole thing, the serpent's body undulating, slithering silently across the ancient earth. At the month end, there was an oval mound as if the snake were about to swallow an egg, as snakes sometimes did in our rickety hen house. Okay, so I'm gonna stop and actually swallow an egg. So over here, our narrator is going through the differences between winter and summer, right? In terms of the creek's characteristics. And it's also saying that the area looks kind of like a serpent's body. This goes back to the title of the poem, Serpent's Mound, right? So it kind of looks like a coiled snake. And so that's how they're that's how they're describing the actual area here, or like the marsh. So this is trying to give you a lot of visual kind of figurative language to work through, description. All right, let's move through the last of it. Swallow an egg, as snakes sometimes did in our rickety hen house, my pa always said. Or as if swallowing the sun, one of the museum men suggested, taking notes with his quill pen, an old-style inkhorn slung at his side. I like that, swallowing the sun, just the sort of thing a snake might want to do. When later I told my sister Ruth, she disagreed. It is singing to the sun, she insisted. That is why its mouth is wide open, she said. Sometimes I think I hear it on summer nights, not swallowing, singing. So this is probably the most interesting part of the poem out of everything else. We get 3 different perspectives here. We get the pa, right, the father, saying that the snake looks like it's swallowing. It looks like it's swallowing the sun, like it's. It looks like it's swallowing an egg, because to the father, that's what's practical and what he knows and what he's seeing, right? Because he's saying, and the narrator says, as snakes sometimes did in our rickety hen house. The museum men or the archaeologists think that, or maybe it's swallowing the sun, and the reason why they probably think that way is because they're probably thinking in terms of, because this was built in the year 300 to 1100, an ancient kind of ritual. And to the young girl, Ruth, his sister, our narrator's sister, she's saying that it looks like it's singing, not swallowing. So everyone, based off their age and experience, gives an interpretation of this park, or this, Serpent Mound. Does everyone understand that? And understanding that is probably the most important part of this last piece. Okay. So one thing that I'll say is I went much slower this time around than before, and that's because this was a harder passage. Poems tend to be harder, so you should take your time with them, but it's not good. But usually chances are, once you understand it, the questions are not going to be that difficult. So let's go through the questions right now. 42. How does the poem's form contribute to the poem's meaning? Well, look, it's one continuous stanza, but it's coiled like a snake, like slithering. We should have noticed that right away. That was definitely going to be a question because it's so different. So it's snake-like. So the answer is going to be, well, snake-like, and oh, the mound is serpent mound, so it's like the mound as well. So the answer is going to be E. The use of one continuous ends and the pattern of the lines mimic the long and winding shape of the mound. Let's go through the other ones just to be sure. The uneven line lengths emphasize the variety of ways people interpret the meaning of the mound. No, because they're not interpreting the meaning, right? They're more so thinking about why does the snake look like it's swallowing? That's different. The dashes throughout the poem highlight the speaker's changing thoughts on the significance of the mound. No, the speaker doesn't really think it's any more or less significant than he did in the beginning. The lack of regular rhyme scheme and meter convey that the speaker struggles to comprehend the vastness of the mound. No, it's not about how large it is. So that's wrong. All right, 43. Which lines reveal how the setting affects the speaker and the men from the museum? So how the setting affects it. Well, we remember that it was winter, right? And in the winter time, he says that it's kind of quiet. Silence of the creek pressed down on all of us like a weight. All of us meaning our narrator as well as the museum men. So that's going to be answer choice, and you're right there, B. You'll see that once you get a feel for the passages, which I think a lot of you have because you've been practicing for so long, you'll naturally think of the right answers beforehand. I always try to get students to think of it in terms of the mindset of a test maker, because then you know how they're going to try to trick you as well, and how to avoid those, how to avoid being tricked by those things as well. All right. Why wouldn't it be C? The humps in the ground were all but invisible until you're right up on them. So let's go back to C, 16 to 17. The humps in the ground were all but invisible until you were right up on them. So this talks about the humps being invisible, right? But this is only from the narrator's perspective. It's not everyone's. And the question was, how does the setting affect the speaker and the men from the museum? Whereas in the previous sentence, it says, but the winter silence of the creek pressed down on all of us. So that's everyone, not just the speaker. That's the difference between the two. Does that answer your question, Alexandra? Sorry. Okay, great. For 44, lines 1 to 2 contribute to the development of ideas in the past and of the poem by doing what? So we got to go back to lines 1 to 4. Brush Creek stood low when the museum men came with their measuring tapes and sketchbooks. So this is setting up the plot, kind of. Why are narrators even talking about it and looking at it, right? So it's suggesting that men are too busy with their work to talk to the speaker, helping establish the reason for the men's visit and purposeful behavior. That's probably our best one. Hinting that the men have hidden motives for studying the mound. Nope, it doesn't hint at anything as such as that. Indicating why the speaker is fascinated by the men and wants to help them. So it definitely speaker is interested in the man, but it never says he wants to help them. So H is gone. Between E and F, suggesting that the men are too busy with their work to talk to the speaker, helping establish the reason for the men's visit and purposeful behavior. We know that they're not too busy to speak, right? So that's not going to be E. So the answer has to be F. All right, are we good to move on to number 45? All right. It says, read line 28 from the poem. At the mouth end, there was an oval mound. How does the line contribute to the development of ideas in the poem? Well, let's go back to line 28, because that's where they told us to go back to. At the mouth end, there was an oval mound as if the snake were about to swallow an egg, as snakes sometimes did in a rickety henhouse. So this one began the entire conversation about what could be the meaning, right, of the oval mound. So that's why it was important to mention, right, because they were going to contemplate or guess about the different types of meaning that the mound has. And that answer literally is answer choice C. Let's go through the other choices just to be safe. It describes a feature of the mound that the men from the museum need to document and introduce a comparison of the body of the mound with the head of the mound. It describes a part of the mound that is difficult to see from far away. Okay. So yeah, once again, after reviewing everything, it definitely introduces a feature of the mound, has different meaning to different people, because that's what the rest of that exchange was all about. Okay, let's move on to the next set. 46. What impact do the phrases all but invisible and even less obvious in lines 16 to 18 have on the meaning of the poem? Okay, so all but invisible and. All right, let's take a look. I'm gonna go back to lines 16 to 18. The humps in the ground were all but invisible until you were right up on them. So it's just stressing the fact, right, that until a person is super close to the humps in the ground, then they wouldn't be able to see it, right? And though the phrase is even less obvious, indicates that a person must be far away to see the overall snake shape of the mound. Does that make sense to everyone? So then the answer to number 46 is going to be answer choice E, right? They indicate that viewing the full size shape of the mound is difficult, right? Because they were saying that only when you get to the humps, you're able to see that they were invisible. So it's hard to see everything from far, far away, right? Or understand the entire, size of it all. For 47, what impact do the words swish, chitter, and cry in lines 12 to 13 have in the poem? Well, they're sound words, right? So they make it seem much more alive. So let's go back to those lines. I listened for the swish of a beaver's heavy tail, the chitter of chickadee, or the cry of a hawk, but the winter silence of the creek pressed down on all of us like a weight. So showing the sounds of the summer and where they're coming from in the creek. So the answer for 47 has to be, they illustrate how lively the mountain's surroundings are during the summer. Okay. 48. How does the speaker's interaction with root in lines 37 to 41 convey a central idea of the poem? Well, central idea of the poem is people's interpretations depend on their age and their own experiences. So what do you think is the best answer for number 48? Well, let's go through the choices. It suggests that the most accurate interpretation of the mound came from knowing the purpose of the mound. It emphasizes that there are multiple interpretations of the mound based on feelings and experience. F is the one that we're leaning towards. It reveals the benefit of considering different interpretations of the mound's significance. Well, it doesn't talk about what the benefit of it is. It just says that it's happening. That's the difference between F and G. And that's why F is the better / safer answer. H, it implies a scientific study of the mound's purpose will affect what the mound symbolizes to people. Okay. So the answer is going to be F. All right. 49. The poet contrasts the speaker's and Root's point of views regarding the mound by using dialogue to do what? So this is going back to what's the purpose of the dialogue. So let's go back to where they use the dialogue. When later I told my sister Ruth, she disagreed. It is singing to the sun, she insisted. That is why its mouth is open. She said, sometimes I think I hear it on summer nights, not swallowing, but singing. So look at what the poet used right before going through the dialogue exchange. Ruth disagreed, and it was singing to the sun, she insisted, right? And so those are the different points of views that the speaker and Ruth have in regards to the mound. And so, it's clear that the poet uses the word insisted in line 39 to show that Ruth firmly believes in her own interpretation of the sound, right? So it's just that they believe that their own interpretations are better or the best ones. That's the key takeaway from this. So the answer has to be answer choice D, show that Ruth has already decided on her interpretation of the mound. A lot of people might ask, why isn't it C? Suggests that Ruth wants the speaker to agree with her interpretation of the mound. There's no way to assume and know that for sure. We just know that Ruth knows what she believes in, not what she can try to convince the reader to believe. So letter B indicate that Ruth hopes her interpretation of the mound will be shared by the men from the museum. Nope, there's no indication of that. Imply that Ruth is worried that her interpretation of the mound will be seen as too abstract. Well, we kind of got rid of that. That's not what the dialogue is used for right now. So the answer is D. Any questions on the poem? Okay. With poetry, I find that it's just always better to go at a slower pace than you would regular reading. And that's going to make the difference for you. All right. Before I take final questions from you all, I just want to give you all a piece of advice. So sleep is extremely important. And I know that you guys are used to getting up early in the morning for school anyway. And if you're taking it on this Thursday in 2 days, then you're going to have to get ready at the same time anyway for that as well. Now, going back to the idea of sleep, you must sleep in enough hours on Wednesday night going into Thursday as you should go on Tuesday night tonight going into Wednesday. The reason being is if you stay up really late at night for no reason or to study or whatever it else may be on Tuesday night and then try to catch up with that sleep on Thursday, that's not going to work. That's not how Wednesday, that's not how catching up on sleep works in general, right? It'll only confuse your brain even more. If you slept it for 4 hours and then you end up sleeping for like 12 hours, and your brain's like, whoa, what's going on, right? Because it's not sure what to adapt to. So that's one thing that I want to talk about. 2 is the day of the exam, the morning of the exam, you should do this. If any of you play any sports, you know that you need to warm up before you're able to fully participate. Think of the SHSAT or taking the exam as one such sport. And to fully participate, what do you need to do? You need to warm up. The best way to warm up would be to do practice passage and math questions and grammar passage a little bit like a mini test right before the test or the morning of as you're driving over there or commuting over to school. The reason why is those are your stretches. You've done those passages before, or those math questions before, so it shouldn't stress you out. You already know how to do them. You're just kind of like warming up your brain, right? You can think of it as like preheating the oven, right? You're not fully, all the gears aren't moving completely flawlessly, but it's getting there. It's kind of like that. I can't tell you how helpful that advice has been, because when people take a test, they're usually like rusty and they need to get into test mode the first few questions in and they lose points. And that's not what you want to do either. Okay. Next up, the day of the test, make sure to have a good, healthy breakfast. Bring snacks with you just in case you're allowed to use like or allowed to eat a protein bar or a bottle of water if they'll allow it. If not, worst case scenario, it stays in your bag. It's not the end of the world. That's important. Next up, do a complete comprehensive review from now until Wednesday, 6 p.m. After Wednesday, 6 p.m., there should be no more studying. You should relax, try to get to bed early. I know it's going to be hard. You'll be tossing and turning, but just try to, shut everything else down and go to sleep, because you need to sleep an ample amount of time before the test. All right. The other thing that I'll say is people have asked this before. What section should you start off with? So I'm going to go back to that idea of performance and stress. And you want to be at an optimal level like here. Well, one way to do that is, what do you mean by a full study session of the test leading up to the test? So I'll explain what that means. So performance versus stress would look like this. If you are starting any test, your stress levels are usually a bit too high. They're like up here. But if you start off doing a section that you feel more comfortable with and an easier section for you, then you start bringing them down because you're building confidence. So that's why I highly recommend starting off with a section that you feel more comfortable with. So if you're a math person, start off with the math section. If you're a reading person, start off with the reading section. If you're a grammar person, start off with the grammar, revising your editing section. And the reason why you should be doing that is because that's the system in which you should be producing the best results. You'll be fully warmed up when you go into the section that you find a bit more challenging. What do I mean by a full study session the days leading up to the test? So a full study session would be looking back at one of the tests that you've reviewed or that you've done in the past and going through all of the questions blank on a piece of paper that you got wrong and making sure that you now know how to do them correctly and what mistake you made last time so you don't repeat that mistake. What if you don't have a particular strong suit for ELA or math? For a lot of students, when they feel that way, Lucius, they just take the test in the order that's given because that's what they're used to doing. If until now you started with your weakest subject first, should test day be the first day you start with your best subject? No, you shouldn't really be making any big changes, but this is what I have felt in the past, and this is what's worked for me. It's because if you start with your weakest subject, right, or the lesser of the two that you're stronger with, that your weaker subject, then what ends up happening is you're already stressed out, and then you might make silly mistakes on a section that you already don't feel that great about. And that's why I always try to tell students to start with, or make a habit of starting with a section that you're more comfortable with first. All right. Try to get to school a little bit earlier, just because there may be, I don't know, a lot more, it shouldn't be an issue there, but a lot more, I guess, kind of things that your teachers need to go through in terms of setting up. And so you don't want to be walking in late while everyone's in the middle of setting up. And if you're late, your nerves are going to be worse than they would be otherwise. So make sure that that's there. Make sure that you have your ticket, right? And that the order in which you guys the order in which you guys could what's it called? Put, you rank your schools in the right order that you have agreed with your family already, because they usually ask you to rank it when you do take the test. The other thing I'll say is make sure you have number 2 pencils for the Scantron and the bubble sheet to bubble them in properly. Are there any other questions that any of you have for me? Yeah, so when I say study, Chloe, it means basically if you've done a test before and in this test you remember doing this passage and you like this passage, just take a printout of just that passage, a blank copy, and a few math questions that you've done before and you're like, oh, I remember how to do these. They're pretty straightforward. They shouldn't take me too long. Take like 5 or 10 of them, like 2 pages at most of the math, and like maybe a set of grammar. And then what you can do is you can put all of that together into like a mini packet, right? And I would say recommend doing it the night before the test. And when you put that mini packet together, that will be your warm-up packet in the morning as you're driving to school on the bus or on the train or whatever it may be, because there you're able to warm up. Does that make sense? Like doing those things that you've already done before. So it's not that you're going to see brand new problems when you're warming up, but it's just you're going to get like the gears revving up in your head, right? The gears turning in your head, on what you're supposed to be doing. Just to make sure, Vincent said, so sorry, I'm going to go backwards just so I can see the questions. So to make sure, if I've been doing ELA first, but math is my strong suit, I should do ELA first because I'm used to it. Yes, Vincent, correct. Emma, I can have your email so I can email you because I want to have a copy of the reading comprehension strategies. Thank you. So I'm going to actually send all of this over to Ms. Kweller, and she'll be the one that would be the point person to try to get this through to everyone, just because I don't know how to best take care of it on that end. So with it being the last minute, I want to just wish you all luck. I think all of you, have been working very hard for a while. And for that reason, this isn't something like this one day of reading strategies is just meant to kind of bring all of that back together. But I'm sure all of you have been working hard for many months leading up to this. Don't be too nervous. You've put in the work. Go in on Thursday. Don't stress out about it too much. And I'm sure all of you will do great. So best of luck. And Ms. Queller's email should be fk@kwellerprep.com. Yeah. All right. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye. Please stay muted. Have a great one. Best of luck. Yes, Alexandra. All right. Take care, everyone. I'm glad this was helpful. Have a great one. I'm going to be ending the meeting now.